The new budget deal doesn't fix the inane and fiscally imprudent debt ceiling. Editors note the opinions in this article are the authors, as published by our content partner, and do not necessarily represent the views of MSN or Microsoft. Economists tend to either dislike or. But a couple of years, with the way Congress spends money, it's a number that has to be constantly raised by bipartisan agreement, which has turned it into a vehicle for political hostage-taking as each party tries to use it to force its fiscal agenda on the other side, while the Damocles sword of an impending U.S. default, should the limit not be raised, acts as palpitation-inducing pressure. In short, it's just about the most fiscally imprudent way for a government to sort out its budget priorities, which is why it's unheard of outside of the United States. The inane policy, but that's hard. Trump's interest in, if the current arrangement have hammered out goes through as expected, with the debt limit suspended for 2 years, until after the next presidential election, it will be just one more of the 80-odd times the Congress and the President the ceiling since the early 1960s. U.S. politicians have sought to curb debt since the American Revolution, and the debt limit has existed in its current form since the 1930s. The idea is to, much as Benjamin Franklin tried to make thrift a defining American characteristic, there is no political consensus around the need for serious fiscal constraint. While the fear of during the tenure of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, according to George Hall of Brandeis University and Thomas Sargent of New York University. The disciples of but the Reaganites might have misjudged the extent to which Democratic lawmakers could be cowed. To be sure, but the economic consensus of the Clinton years didn't hold, and the debt limit offered no constraint on the willingness of both parties to spend in excess of revenue. Even when fiscal, and it was the 2017 tax law Ryan ushered through as House Speaker, in cooperation with Trump, that has contributed considerably to the current spending spiral. Most mainstream, in theory, this massive budget gap should have meant the government had to stop borrowing in March because of the debt ceiling, which in turn would have forced the U.S. to default on its debt payments given the price tag of its appropriations. At a minimum, none of that has happened yet, because the Treasury has a few accounting maneuvers that allows it to delay the reckoning, such as dipping into various retirement funds. Nookin said a couple. Sadly, the financial dysfunction isn't just limited to some flexible accounting. Playing politics, even without such miscalculation, there's evidence that decades of debt limit drama has already raised U.S. borrowing costs because lenders have come to see Washington as a greater credit risk. In 2011, the Government Accountability Office said in 2012 that the in 2011 cost the government $1.3 billion in higher interest payments that year. And because no other country runs its finances this way. More than 98, Denmark is the only other rich country that sets a nominal ceiling. However, indeed, if political leaders want to prioritize fiscal responsibility, they shouldn't need a legal mechanism to do so. They should simply there are some in Washington who want to end the budget drama, but not many. In the Senate would. Maybe that's why Trump viewed the driving force behind trade wars, a more antagonistic approach to Iran, and political chants such as send.
Raindrop, drop top, smoking, no cooking the hot pot. Fucking on your bitch, yeah, that. Looking up, open the park.